Greetings. This is part 4 of my deep dive series on Edward Abbey's master's thesis, Anarchism and the Morality of Violence. Today we're going to focus on Michael Botkin. Brief background on Edward Abbey. He's known for being an environmental writer. You should definitely read his books if you're interested in learning more about him. He wrote this thesis in 1959, and we're going to watch a clip of a talk he gave, very short talk he gave in 1972 at age 45, which is 3 years after his seminal nonfiction work Desert Solitaire was published. He was 32 when this thesis was published and 62 when he died.
I think the major danger to this area is too much economic development, too much road building, too much oil exploration, mineral exploration, development of commercial tourism. I think southeast Utah is one of the great adventure places left on Earth, and I think we should try to keep it wild and primitive. It really is the property not only of all the American people, but maybe of all the people of the world. There aren't many places left like this on Earth, and I think its chief value is not only its beauty, but its wildness, the fact that so much of it is still hard to get into.
That clip was recorded 13 years after this thesis was written, and it's clear to me that Abbey has, at this point in his life, started to incorporate his ideas around how government should be run, how public land should be managed, and how wilderness should be protected with his ideas around anarchism. I think this is what Abbey means when he talks about the danger of economic development, such as mineral exploration, being the big threat to this area, and the true value of southwestern Utah being its rugged natural environment. Let me know what you think about this idea in the comments below. Today we're going to focus on Mikhail Bakunin, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that well because I'm not a native Russian speaker, and I'm going to use the more Western version of his name, which is Michael Botkin, and even that might not be pronounced very well. And I don't want that to distract from his ideas, and specifically what Edward Abbey thinks of his ideas within the 2 questions he asked in his thesis. Question 1. To what extent is the traditional association of anarchism and violence warranted? And question 2. Insofar as the association is a valid one, what arguments have the anarchists presented explicitly or implicitly to justify the use of violence? Question mark. So those are our 2 questions. And the purpose of this thesis, as Abbey writes, is to investigate these questions. Next, I'm going to do a little background on Botkin before we get into the text, just in case folks aren't too familiar with his philosophy. Michael Botkin, a Russian revolutionary and philosopher who lived from 1814 to 1876. Botkin was born into an aristocrat family in the Russian province of Tver, or Tver. He was educated in Russia, Germany, and France, where he became involved in the leftist revolutionary circles. He was particularly influenced by the anarchist philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and eventually became a leading figure in the anarchist movement himself. Botkin believed in a society without government or hierarchical authority, in which people would cooperate freely and spontaneously He opposed all forms of state power, including both traditional and monarchies of his time and the emerging socialist states. He argued that workers and peasants should organize themselves into self-governing communities which would federate together voluntarily for mutual aid and defense. His revolutionary activities brought him into conflict with the authorities in several countries. He was imprisoned and exiled multiple times and spent much of his life on the run. He was a central figure in the failed 1848 revolution in France and played a key role in the First International, a loose association of socialist and labor organizations. Botkin's ideas continued to influence anarchist and anti-authoritarian movements around the world. He was remembered for his commitment to freedom and equality and his rejection of all forms of oppression and domination. Abbey had a lot to say about Botkin. He spent 10 pages of his thesis on the political philosophy of Botkin, and his section follows that of Goodwin and Proudhon, starting on page 20 and going to page 29. So technically it's just 9 pages. So in this first segment, second half of page 20, he starts by comparing Goodwin and Proudhon to Botkin. The Industrial Revolution really got traction in the mid to late 1800s when Botkin came on the scene, and Edward Abbey's description of what was going on at the time and how that connects to anarchism reflects that. When he writes, "The overwhelming success of large-scale industrialism and capitalism, however, reduced this class to political and economic impotence. Most of its members were destined to end with their necks in white collars as minor clerks, officials, and functionaries within the industrial hierarchy. Those who remained outside the machine became so few in numbers as to be socially powerless. Those within the machine supported the machine. If anarchism was to become an effective force in politics, then a new source of support would have to be found. It was the role of Botkin to give anarchism a renewed vigor by combining the libertarianism of Goodwin and Proudhon with the socialism of Marx, thus making it possible for anarchism to appeal not only to isolated intellectuals, but also to the newly created multitudes of unhappy factory workers." Whew, that was an epically long sentence. I would have told Abbey to break that into like 10 sentences. Lots to unpack there. But in short, he's just saying that everybody works in factories now and they're unhappy. Botkin comes after Goodwin and Proudhon, and that is his niche. He can influence these unhappy factory workers to help execute on his vision of an anarchist revolution. The first paragraph on page 21 ends by Abbey talking about how Botkin supported every single attempt to overthrow a government system, and that he inspired the nihilist territorialists in Russia and all those younger men and women who in the late 19th and early 20th century attempted to overthrow the existing order. I'm not sure how he would do that directly because he was dead. And in Abbey's view, he sees this as evidence that Botkin had no qualms concerning the use or even abuse of violence. He was in the violent camp on both the he justified it on a morality level, let's just say that, connected directly to the second question in Abbey's thesis. So he's a yes on both of those questions. This concept of Botkin being pro-violence in all contexts that are connected directly back to, overthrowing a government that's existing to implement an anarchist regime is further supported as Abbey continues to talk about Botkin. So we see that in this first quote from him, which talks about revolution means war and implies the destruction of men and things. And that quote ends with been baptized in blood. That's part of the last sentence. So, 22 is just all about the blood and death component of a revolution. In paragraph 2 on page 22, he goes on to talk about why this is the way he sees it. And he says the final emancipation of the proletariat from the economic injustice by the state is going to be a terrible and bloody struggle. And the reason is because in Botkin's view, the institutions that make up this society he doesn't like has an alliance that's really strong, and people believe that it works, and that in his mind can never be changed without a and I'm going to quote, terrible bloody struggle, which I find pretty pragmatic and realistic and authentic. He's not just spouting philosophy here, even though I, as a reader and historian, disagree with this idea. I don't think that violence is a good thing in any form. So on page 23, we start off with Edwards Abbey's ideas on Botkin's thoughts on the scale of the problem. He writes, any attempt to rely on revolution in a single country would invite a conspiracy among surrounding countries to destroy the revolution. It's an indication that in Botkin's mind, revolutions have to be on the biggest scale possible. First paragraph justifies violence further and ends with, we can win liberty only through the use of force. Second paragraph on page 23 talks about a post-revolutionary recognition that the violence should end and society should be a space of equality, with the caveat that that space of equality is only for the people who supported the revolution, and everybody who was not supported of the revolution and not killed during the fighting is to be exiled and shamed for the rest of their days. So pretty radical in my opinion. On page 24, Abbey writes about how Botkin was not troubled by his contradictions. And I see a parallel there between Botkin and Edward Abbey's own ideas and the many contradictory ideas he had in his life. For example, he worked for the government, the Forest Service, for years and years and years before he could survive on a writing salary, basically until he was in his 40s and Desert Solitaire was published. He later on worked for a state institution, the University of Arizona, until he died. So both men had a lot of contradiction there. Looking at this thesis more directly, though, the last part of the first paragraph on page 24 ends by talking about Botkin's advocacy for violence in its most wild and blindest forms. For him, that is progressive disorder, and it's a good thing, which is very radical to this day. Abbey ends page 24 with a quote by the scholar that reads as follows: "The sentiment of rebellion, this satanic pride which spurns subjection to any master whatsoever, whether of divine or human origin, alone produces in man a love for independence and freedom." Page 24 ends with a citation that talks about how Botkin was punished for these ideas by being imprisoned and chained to a wall and held in solitary confinement. There was no freedom of speech in Russia at the time of Botkin's writings and the spread of his ideas. He was put in jail for them and not treated well when he was in jail. It's a stark contrast to the freedom of speech Edward Abbey enjoyed in the United States, where he was allowed to write about these ideas of overthrowing the government and live freely and openly, despite being investigated by the FBI from the time he was an undergraduate, where he first promoted his ideas of sedition, really until the day he died. And unfortunately, most of his FBI records haven't been released. Only some of them have been released. Page 25 opens with a quote on the vast destruction of property. Put in the comments below if you recognize the philosopher Proudhon is learned that idea from. I'm not going to just give it away. And to kind of close the idea of Edward Abbey's freedom of speech, I'm just glad he didn't have to spend years and years in a jail cell like Botkin did. Page 25, paragraph 2 starts with a heavy-hitting line that reads as follows: "In social obstetrics only, the cesarean section is to be permitted." And after that, Abbey goes on to describe how Botkin continued to attach himself to every revolution he could when he was not in jail, and even when he was in jail. He references his role in the Dresden Uprising of 1849, says he was involved by accident, and that even 10 years after his imprisonment and return to Europe, he would try and participate in uprisings. These include the Lyons Affair, 1871, and the Bulligan, 1874. That leads us to page 26. Starts with another punchy line: "Everything Botkin attempted ended in failure, but at least he was there." Was there is underlined, risking his liberty and life and often dignity in badly planned, poorly organized, inconclusive, and inconsequential revolts. In paragraph 2 on page 26, Abbey talks about if Botkin's ideas around violence can be justified morally through his eyes, Abbey's eyes. And he says that Botkin advocates for violence but never actually kills anyone. He never actually hurts anybody physically. And because of that, he categorizes him as not quite crossing that moral line of morally justifying violence, because in Abbey's eyes, you would have to actually commit violence to be morally there. He writes that therefore Botkin's justification of violence is at least as plausible as the justification made for certain good and honorable wars. The end justifies the method, and the method is not entirely devoid of scruples. Wars are fought traditionally within the framework of certain rules. Page 26 ends with Edward Abbey saying that Botkin doesn't go far enough to be easily categorized within Abbey's own framework. Page 27, we're not done. We're going to dig deeper into Botkin and the people who influenced him, the people he was friends with, specifically this person named Nicheve. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. This revolutionary friend of Botkin killed someone who disagreed with his ideas, and that gave him more clout in Botkin's camp, and Edward gave Botkin another point, metaphorically speaking, in his morality of violence category and question. And that's page 27. Page 28. Page 28 talks about how Nicheve continues to escalate and be extreme in his willingness to be violent. Botkin, so much so that Botkin separates himself from this person he was so infatuated with, and that causes Edward Abbey to start to think differently about him at this point in his life and career as a revolutionary. All right, page 29. First paragraph is the last paragraph on this thinker, and we end with the following. Either he was a deliberate hypocrite and cynic who preached one doctrine while practicing another, or two, he was childishly susceptible to the persuasions of a fanatic. Such a weakness in matters involving human life is a criminal weakness. In either case, his associations with Nicheve make possible the most sinister interpretations of Botkin's lifelong enthusiasm for violence. If justified, these interpretations would include Botkin in the company of revolutionary absolutists who, in the name of perfect justice, in the remote future feel entitled to commit the most shocking injustices in present. So we're ramping up here, right? In conclusion, we've talked about 3 philosophers within this thesis. The first 2, not really in the violent camp, and then this one is moderately within the violent camp. And I'm thinking the next one will be more in the violent camp, looking at the way this is unfolding. We'll see. Stick around if you want to find out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around.